Welcome to another edition of HSF Conversations. Philip Morgan and I, Matt Bracey, come to you at this time with what we believe is an exciting episode. We are looking at teacher, scholar, shepherd, essays in honor of Robert E. Pickerilly. Philip and I had the opportunity to be general editors of this volume. It's published with Randall House and D6 Family Ministries. And I would mention that there are several HSF members who have contributed to this volume. In addition to Philip and I, Jesse Owens, Jackson Watts, who was previously associated with the HSF, has contributed. Christopher Talbot has also contributed a chapter. What I want to do in this episode, in this interview, is to give a very quick overview of the book, looking at its chapters and authors. And then I want to ask Philip Morgan some questions here about his work particularly. In several weeks, there should be an episode coming out with the Better Together podcast with Dr. Eddie Moody, in which he talks more broadly about the book and about the chapters and about the sections in his interview with us. But for this interview, we're going to look specifically at a few chapters once we get past a general overview. So, Teacher, Scholar, Shepherd is a festschrift in honor of the work of Dr. Pickerilly. It's divided into three parts of chapters and then a fourth part of tributes. So, part one is chapters 1 through 4. Jesse Owens writes on Dr. Pickerilly and the extent of the atonement. Dr. Hester writes on Dr. Hester and the freedom of Dr. Pickerilly and the freedom of the will and determinism. Matthew McAfee writes on Dr. Pickerilly and apostasy in 2 Peter and Hebrews. And then W. Jackson Watts writes on Dr. Pickerilly and the Holy Spirit and tongues. Part one concerns theology generally, and so you can see the theme there. Part two concerns church history and philosophy. Richard Clark writes on Pickerilly and Arminius. Philip Morgan here writes on Pickerilly and Free Will Baptist history, and I write on Pickerilly and philosophy. Part three concerns practical theology and biblical studies. Barry Raper writes on Dr. Pickerilly and the church and the pastor. Christopher Talbot writes on Dr. Pickerilly and his emphasis on faith and works. Jeff Cockrell writes on Dr. Pickerilly and his work with Paul the Apostle. Martin Sheldon writes on Dr. Pickerilly and his work in New Testament Greek studies. And then in chapter 12, the late Thomas Marbury writes on Dr. Pickerilly and his work as commentator and editor. And then finally, in part 4, we have 4 different tributes. Dr. Pickerilly's daughters write a joint piece on Pickerilly as father. The late F. Leroy Forlines writes on Dr. Pickerilly as a colleague and a friend. J. Matthew Pinson writes on Dr. Pickerilly as a college leader. And then Eric Thompson writes on Dr. Pickerilly as a denominational leader. So that's an overview of Teacher, Scholar, Shepherd. For this interview, we're going to zero in on 2 chapters in particular, namely the ones that Philip and I wrote. But before we talk about Dr. Pickerilly and Free Will Baptist history, Philip, tell us about what got you into this project in the first place and why you felt like it was something to pursue.
Well, I think the idea originally began in 2016 as we were wrapping up work on the festschrift for Mr. Forlines, which you and Jackson Watts had led the editing for that book. And I was fortunate enough to be invited in to write a chapter on Mr. Forlines' thinking on worldview and culture. And I had such a good experience with that, and I thought that that was also a wonderful way to honor and to also to honor the work of Mr. Forlines, but also to really kind of expose people to a lot of things that had gone out of print or that were little known. And so around that same time, I had been working with Dr. Piccirilli on a regular basis in the historical collection, kind of learning the ropes of how to curate the historical collection. And, he and I were spending an afternoon together once a week, sometimes twice a week, over a regular, or, for a regular, each week for roughly 3 or 4 years there. And so I got to know him personally. I had heard lots of stories about him from my parents who went to Welch in the 1970s. And then, of course, my pastors over the years. And, just anybody who was in the denomination who had been to the college, they spoke really highly of him. And so I thought it would be a great way for us to really highlight Dr. Piccirilli's influence and his work, and then to perhaps reveal some things about his work that people weren't that familiar with. So a lot of people had taken his course in Pauline writings, or in taking Greek from him, or Christian philosophy. But there are lots of other areas of his work that not necessarily everyone had read after. And so I thought that this would be a good way to bring all of those things together into a accessible work, and to really celebrate all that he's done for Free Will Baptist and for Arminian theology, and for the Christian church, and to also kind of draw people's attention to works that they might not have been aware of before.
To what extent do you see this volume and the volume in honor of Mr. Forlines, to what extent do you see these as companion pieces?
Well, to some degree, we looked for ways that we would kind of keep parallels that were appropriate. And it was helpful that you were editor on both volumes. In the general layout, we kept some of that connection, even in the selection of the cover and some of the other things. We wanted to keep those associations there. They're not exactly companion pieces, but there was some obvious connections, both being festschrifts, both of them being they are really the major thought leaders of Free Will Baptist for the 20th century. You and I have talked on a couple of occasions. There are other people who are important and influential, both politically or theologically, but there's really just no one who has the same heft intellectually as Mr. Forlines and Dr. Piccirilli over the 20th century. And of course, they were colleagues for many years working at Welch College, and they were friends. And so that seemed to be, kind of a natural connection as well there.
Something I would point out is that there are even some aesthetic choices. You mentioned the cover. There are even some aesthetic choices between the two volumes to demonstrate something of a connection.
Mm.
And of course, they were students together,
Right.
and then they came to work at Welch around the same time,
Yes.
and served the denomination and the school for half a century or
Right.
more.
Yeah, and I think that also, Mr. Forlines has said this, and Dr. Piccirilli has said as well, that they were very influential in each other's thinking.
Hmm.
And if in some cases it was simply to have someone to debate or argue through points together. And Dr. Piccirilli wrote the one of the tributes for Mr. Forlines' festschrift, and we were fortunate enough that in 2018 I was able to do an interview with Mr. Forlines and about his work with Dr. Piccirilli, and we were able to turn that into a tribute for this book as well. So that kind of has that parallel as well. But they both, gave credit to each other for really helping them to refine their thinking and their ideas, and certainly they're wonderful minds, and they would have done wonderful things on their own. But they we have been the benefit of their relationship as well.
What does their relationship say to us today about what relationships can do? What relationships can do that where you have people who are willing to challenge each other?
Mm.
In other words, what can we today, whether we're pastors, whether we're teachers, whether we're in administration, whatever our particular vocations are, what can we learn from their relationship today about the way that we ought to work through our ideas?
Well, I think the point that stands out that perhaps seems so unlike our current context and our current cultural expectations is that they were not afraid to be confrontational with each other, not in an unhealthy way, but to really challenge each other's ideas and to push back on each other and to um, engage one another in a really meaningful way and not just kind of out of maybe an overwrought sense of politeness or kindness, not engage someone's thinking and not challenge it. And so, and I know from my own experience working in youth ministry in the 21st century for several years, and then being an instructor at Welch, and just dealing with people, is that there's a lot of fear that you're going to hurt people's feelings if you, not by doing something rude, but just by disagreeing with them. We're saying, I think that idea is wrong, and just being outright and upfront about it and saying, you know, eh, pointing out holes in people's arguments and then working through that. It's not a dismissive thing. It's not even saying someone's ideas aren't valuable. In fact, it's taking them very seriously. And so I got the sense that their discussions, they took one another very seriously, and they went at it hammer and tongs sometimes. I mean, very intensely. And so I think that that's a very beneficial aspect of a relationship, of a friendship, and it's a good way to develop yourself intellectually. You don't really develop your thinking unless you've had it challenged.
And you're not just operating in silos. There's one of the commandments says, do not bear false witness. And insofar as one of the principles undergirding that commandment is honesty, then it seems to me that part of what you're talking about is two people who respect one another need to be honest with one another. And if you're not being, shall we say, if you're not communicating what you really think, what you really believe, if you're not on some level then you're not on some level being honest. If you're saying something that's not exactly what you think, that's not an excuse to be rude, but it's this balance between truth and grace.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the truth is always, it's challenging and it's divisive. I always think of the illustration of the Bible being like a sword that cuts. Well, swords, they divide what is, between the two things. And the truth does that. And so it can be unpleasant experience to some degree if you expect that everything should just always feel comfortable. But it's an enlivening and an enlightening thing to have true conversations and to have true engagement and interaction.
If God is the author of truth, then this is not something that we should fear in the negative sense.
Yes, that's right. I think it's also it's kind of an aversion to any sort of judgment. There's the other aspect of that, which is that truth is always has a judgment aspect to it. And in our culture, that's the last thing you can do is to make a judgment about anything or anyone. Especially about their ideas or their decisions, because
we're this comment, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but in my chapter, I talk about Dr. Piccirilli and his work in philosophy with particular reference to universals. And so one of the things that Dr. Piccirilli holds is that universals exist, and they exist in God. And so, truth, universals, God, this is all part of the same stuff. If we're Christ followers, if we're believers in the one true God, then we believe in truth and being honest about our truth. And by the way, if we are on this journey as Christians of being sanctified and one day glorified, then we shouldn't feel threatened by the idea that our ideas may need some sharpening. I mean, I assume that personally that my ideas need some sharpening,
right?
Because I've not yet arrived.
Yeah.
And if I'm going to make it to heaven, then my wrong ideas will be sorted out, whether now or later.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's not like they're not going to be at some point. They'll definitely be. That's right. And the I think that there's also a hubris, a pride that comes with assuming that if I voice my idea, you must accept my idea
Mm.
as valid. That's not expecting respect from your interlocutor, to use a fancy word for it, your conversation companion. It's not expecting respect, it's expecting acceptance of whatever comes out of my mouth.
Mm.
That would be that's a very prideful way of thinking of things. And you're right that there's going to come a day where those things are going to be hashed out. And so for the Christian, we're pursuing that now.
Mm.
You know, sanctification isn't merely a moral aspect, it's also an intellectual pursuit. It's a pursuit of the Lord, of knowing him, and by knowing him we also know the truth. And so those things are all very much bound up together.
So we've been talking a little bit about how this book fits with the previous work and exploring a little bit about what their relationship, Mr. Forlines and Dr. Pickerley, what their relationship looked like and how it can inform us. I want to ask one more question before we get to your chapter particularly. I wanted to ask, so each of the authors in this book had, prior to this book actually coming out, they had a rather limited view of the book as a whole, because they were looking at it only through the lens of the chapter that they wrote. You, on the other hand, and I as well, but you particularly, you have a unique view because you're seeing how each of these works fits into the whole. So my question for you, my one question for you before we get to your chapter is this: what did you learn about Dr. Pickerley and his scholarship from your, not as an author, but as an editor of this, perhaps the main editor of this work? What did you learn about Dr. Pickerley and his scholarship, and what can we learn from that vantage point?
Well, there were a number of things that perhaps kind of occurred to me or came to mind as we were going through this process. I think the number one thing that I was struck by was how diverse his interests were. They he did work in a number of areas that are not necessarily seen as being interrelated. He's very famous for his work in Arminian theology. And so there's a significant section that deals with his Arminian scholarship.
And I'll add, he's not respected only among Free Baptists for his Arminian scholarship.
Right.
He is a major voice in broad evangelical scholarship.
That's right. Yes, that's right. And so there's that aspect. But then he was also writing about Free Will Baptist history, which to some degree are connected. And he wants to get at who the real Arminius is. That's an important, historical analysis as well. And so Dr. Clark does a good job of engaging with that material. And so we so those things are somewhat connected, but then he's also interested in philosophy. He's very, very interested in pastoral ministry. He cares about the local church. He cares about having good leaders in the church. He cares about the personal spirituality of Christians. So he's very concerned about avoiding the spirit of the age, which is to have a vague spiritual feeling, but no deep, meaningful, changing Christianity. And then he did Greek studies and he studied Paul. So it's just a very diverse kind of scholarship there. And they're all interesting and unique in their own way. And one of the things I was struck by is that it's also him pursuing his own interests. God gives each of us our own interest for a reason. And Dr. Pickerley pursued those interests to the best of his ability. And he wasn't afraid to strike out on ground that he didn't have what you might call like formal training in. He wasn't trained in pastoral ministry. He wasn't trained in historiography, but he worked through those things, and he had the confidence to be able to study and to work through them and to think carefully about them. So it's not like he just launched out into these things and didn't, do his due diligence. He did, but it's I think a lot of people get scared off by saying, "Well, I don't, I find that really interesting, but I don't know anything about it, and I don't have this or that, and I can't do that." And so he did those things, and he did them very well. So I mean, that is an element of it. He is interesting in his ability to be able to kind of self-start things and do them very well.
Is there a danger? So you're saying that the things that he didn't, say, study in, prop academically or in his background, but then he struck off in those into those directions, and he did so well. He did so with excellence. Is there nevertheless a potential danger in following one's own interests if they don't have a background in it? Is there a danger in that? And if so, how do you avoid that danger?
Well, I don't.
I guess what I'm asking is there an irresponsible way to go off into areas that you don't have a background in?
Sure.
He
Yeah.
didn't do it irresponsibly,
That's right.
you're saying, but
Yeah. No, that absolutely is the case. I mean, just because you have an interest in something, that doesn't mean that you have, therefore, what you call it, the authority to speak on that subject. Um, I think the podcast landscape has taught us that, if nothing else has. But we can.
this idea that you previously mentioned, just because words come out of somebody's mouth doesn't mean that those words are
That's
necessarily
right. Doesn't
true.
mean they're necessarily true. But you can devote your energies to understanding those subjects better.
Mm.
And as you grow in that knowledge, then you can begin to develop a level of authority in that field. Um, I think the what I'm maybe pushing back on is in our current context, there is an extreme emphasis on expertise
Mm.
and credentializing everything. Now, that's not to say that training and credentials are bad. They're not. They have a good purpose and there's a reason for them. But they aren't definitive. People who have credentials and expertise and all the training in the world can be dead wrong. And people who don't have those things, but who have studied well and who have thought well, they can be much more correct. And so I think it's an encouragement to us to pursue the interest that God gives each one of us. And God gives us all these variegated interests for a reason. It makes his creation more full and rich and beautiful.
It sounds like part of what you're saying, a theme that I'm seeing implicitly is that whatever areas we strike out on, we need to do so with humility, deep humility.
Yeah.
And just as the non-experts can be dead wrong, podcast landscape has taught us that. You said the experts can also be dead wrong. And the podcast landscape has also taught us that.
Yes,
as
that's
well.
right. That's right. That's right.
Well, speaking of expertise and training, your expertise and training is in history. You are in the midst of writing a dissertation and getting your PhD in history, and you wrote the chapter on Piccadilly and Free Will Baptist history. What I want to do is just briefly give an overview of what's in this chapter and then ask you several questions about the chapter. So the main subject heads are number one, the Free Will Baptist Historical Collection. You then move to talking about Piccadilly's interest in Free Will Baptist history and in writing Free Will Baptist history, not just collecting it, but writing it, and the origins of that. You also move to Dr. Piccadilly's work in the origins of particular aspects of our history. So the National Association of Free Will Baptists, Free Will Baptist history in Tennessee, Free Will Baptist history in Georgia and South Carolina. You then move to talk about Dr. Piccadilly's work in various unity movements in the Free Will Baptist history. And then you move to talk about his work in biographies and then also in education. And then finally, before your conclusion, you move to a section on historiography. So what I want to do first is ask a broad question. When you think about Dr. Piccirilli and the subject of this chapter, elevator pitch, what comes to your mind? Dr. Piccirilli, history, what's the significance? What comes to your mind? Big picture.
I think the major influence that he has given, contribution he has made in Free Will Baptist history has to do with primary sources in two ways. And I give attention to this in the chapter, but I don't belabor it because I feel like it could be tedious for those that are not experts in this particular field. But his work in the historical collection is deserving of an unbelievable amount of credit. And that would have been worth giving him a great reward just for that alone. He has single-handedly, that's not maybe quite accurate, but he has led the charge in putting together and collecting historical materials for the denomination, and he has preserved them. And we're filming this in the historical collection today here at Welch College. That project was given to the Historical Commission at its formation in 1963 by the National Association of Free Will Baptists, a commission that he was not on at the time. He did not join the commission for about another 10 years. But they were given the task of collecting materials and preserving them and keeping them. And pretty quickly that became connected with what was then Free Will Baptist Bible College, but now Welch College Library. And he spent decades while he was traveling for the school and for the denomination, speaking in various places. Wherever he would go, he would start asking around for, does anybody around here keep old minutes, or do they have any old materials, and could I go talk to them? And so he would find, sweet old ladies in churches that had kept every periodical that had come out from their state paper, or some retired minister who had kept every minute book that he had been to every proceeding of that association, and he would ask them to donate those to the historical collection so they could be preserved for later generations. And but the bulk of his work began after he retired, where he began cataloging and putting all of that together. And I kind of talk about his process for doing that and what a labor that was to do. And it's almost unimaginable how much work that was. And he did it essentially twice, because he did it pre-digitization, and then he did it after the college catalog was digitized. And he also had an important vision for scanning all the minutes that we have to put them online to have for access for researchers anywhere in the world. I can already tell you, I've already benefited immensely from the amount that has been done. I know I've spoken to numerous other researchers. It's just an unbelievable resource, and we're still continuing that process now. So that's one aspect of that, primary sources. The other way in which his work in primary sources has been very influential and valuable is because of that connection with the collection and his unmatched knowledge of what we have here. He also was able to do a lot of deep research into primary sources to write his own historical treatments after his retirement in the late 90s. From full-time work at Welch College, he began doing research and writing at a much more intentional basis. He had written some on history previous to this, but he had just had lots of responsibilities he had to fulfill. And so, but he really began to turn his mind to that. And so he's produced two books that were published through D6 Ministries that have dealt with Free Will Baptist history, various elements of it. And each chapter is kind of a standalone thing. There are some connections, but they are very much focused on primary sources, original documents. He does engage some secondary literature, but it's very deep research into the argument. And so that really stands out from the and I give some analysis of the early Free Will Baptist history writings and how his work interacts with them. A lot of them were basing their accounts on secondary sources and what little primary sources they could kind of cobble together because they just didn't have the historical collection to rely on. And so I think that when I just think generally, his work is primarily around primary sources.
Perhaps I should have asked this question first from your history chapter, and I'm sure that you get some version of this question in your line of work. But one question I want to ask is, I can imagine the person who says, what relevancy really does history generally and Free Will Baptist history particularly, what relevancy does this really have in my life? Why should I care about some pastor in South Carolina 150 years ago? What relevancy does that have for me as a Free Will Baptist today?
Well, Dr. Pickerley addresses this. It's also, historians, we talk about this a lot, but our understanding of our past shapes our identity in the present. And it gives guidance to how we are going to pursue the future, how we react to things that come up. And so Dr. Pickerley believes that it is essential for us to have as deep a knowledge of our history, as accurate a knowledge of our history as we possibly can, because it helps us to better understand ourselves. It helps us to understand why it is that the landscape of Free Will Baptists looks the way it does. When it comes to philosophy of ministry, when it comes to demographics, when it comes to geography, where the layout of most of our churches are, and even our theology. I think it helps us to understand the theological debates within our denomination much better if we have a good and accurate knowledge of where we come from. And so those are the reasons that it's very essential for us to know it and to teach it, not just to pastors or those odd ducks that are interested in history, but we need to be incorporating this in our Sunday school material, and when we're teaching, when we're preaching, we try to incorporate these things when we can. At least I do when I'm teaching Sunday school or preaching.
So part of my background is theology, and at least two analogies or points come to my head about that. One is this: history, by which I mean time and space today, time and space in the future, time and space in the past, anywhere. History is the stage upon which the sovereign and providential and immanent God does his work. So God is transcendent on the one hand, but he's not merely transcendent, because then he would be deist. He's also immanent. So by simply disregarding history anywhere, on the one hand, you can't know everything. On the other hand, to act as if it really has no relevancy in your life whatsoever is a different way of ignoring the good things that God has done on this stage of history. And then that leads to the second idea. Insofar as history specifically impacts us, if we're going to have wisdom in knowing how to respond to the problems of the day, it seems to be we need to know something about how we got here in the first place. And here's the example that I was going to give. If your body is broken or sick or has got a problem going on, you don't just start throwing random things at it. You don't just look in the cabinet and pull out this pill or pull out that pill, or just start doing things helter skelter. You learn something about the anatomy of the body. You learn something about what medicines work. You learn about what's happening with your body before you just start randomly taking medications. So if that's true of the human body, then it seems to me that it's also true of the social body. You don't just look at the social body and say, I think it needs this, I think it needs that. No, you need to understand something about its makeup and how it got here in the first place so that you can more aptly respond to whatever it is you're needing to respond to. What do you think of those ideas?
No, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And back to your point about God revealing himself through history, this is another aspect of where we were talking earlier about knowing the truth. History is important because it's the truth that God is revealing to us over time as well. The truth of who he is. And the scriptures are all very clear to make it, they make it very clear that God is revealing himself through not just the Bible, but through the created order and specifically his interactions with the created order. And I always find it fascinating. I talk about it a lot in my classes here at Welch. But God specifically tells the Israelites as they're about to go into the promised land and they're going to be facing the temptation of idolatry and of kind of commingling and becoming Canaanite. He tells them, here's how you can avoid that. One, obey me. But two, remember all the things that I have done for you and teach them to your children and your grandchildren so that they will remember those things. And that will be a hedge against your temptations to go into idolatry. And so when we study the past, it helps us to know the truth about who God is. And as we learn more about who God is and what he has done in the past, we're more inclined to pursue him.
If you read the Psalms much, if you read Proverbs much, one of the things that you see over and over and over is this theme of remembering,
Mhm.
looking to the past to see what God has done. Uh, in addition to my background being in theology, it's also in political philosophy, and which includes the philosophy of conservatism, liberalism, progressivism, all that stuff. I would argue that at root, we think of conservatism as being a political thing,
Mm.
and it is a political thing, but that's downstream. At its root, conservatism is a disposition that's about conserving the good things of the past,
Mhm.
not the bad things of the past. But that's where reform comes in, not revolution, but reform. To be a Christian that values it, to be a Christian that obeys God is to be a Christian that values history, and to be a Christian that values history is to be a conservative because you're conserving what has been handed down.
Right.
All right, so you move on to talk about Free Baptist origins in various places, the National Association, Tennessee, various states. You talk about unity movements, biographies, education, without repeating yourself about concerning primary sources. I want to ask a sort of meta question about all of these sections. And that question is this: what have you learned about the methodology of Dr. Pickerilly with respect to history
Hmm.
that you find particularly valuable for you and for Free Baptist people and people more generally who are interested in history today? What can we learn from Dr. Pickerilly with respect to his methodology in all of these areas?
Right. One of the skills that he brings from his academic study, his training, is careful analysis of words. Um, Dr. Pickerley received his academic training in biblical studies, particularly Greek, and he takes people's words seriously. He does a lot of careful analysis of people's writing, and he can get very detailed in that as well. But he's taking them very seriously, and he is not trying to um, paint them in a way that necessarily just fits what he would like them to say or what would be more comfortable for others to say. And I find that a very helpful palliative to a lot of the historical research that goes on today. I've read lots and lots of histories that they kind of pull this little snippet from this place and this little snippet from that place. A lot of times they don't give any contextual analysis to it. And then they just go, this proves my point, and here's two sentences from this Puritan minister that proves my point.
But you're saying perhaps that they take that out of context, and it's not careful, and it's
Right.
not excellent,
Or at
not
least there's
thorough.
not enough there to be able to even assess those things,
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
With Dr. Piccirilli,
it's more hodgepodge.
but in the current context, it is with Dr. Piccirilli, he is much more analytical about it. And you might not always necessarily agree with his conclusion, but at least he's shown you, here's how I've gone through all of those steps, and he explains his argument. And I think that generally he does a good job of doing that analysis and that kind of close reading. And I also say that he's also very good about at least making a note toward the context of the moment. And so he when he talks about the development of 19th century Free Will Baptists in the South, in particular, he talks about the context of the Civil War and of Reconstruction and the cultural differences between the North and the South that weren't just based on, not just related to slavery or free market labor, but we're much more broad and deep, and that the war really made that difference much more acrimonious in the second half of the 19th century as well. And so he does a good job of making those connections and of highlighting those things.
So part of what it means to interpret people rightly is not simply to judge people in previous ages from your vantage point, but to try to get into their shoes, to try to get into their mind, to understand what they were going through, and so to demonstrate what the subject of my dissertation is Burke, but to demonstrate what Edmund Burke would call an empathetic or a sympathetic imagination. And not to say that you agree with everything that people did in the past, but you're trying to charitably understand it from his or her perspective. So what you're saying is he demonstrates careful and perhaps sympathetic analysis of anything he puts his mind to.
Yeah, he certainly tries to explain the thoughts of the people he's researching, their actions. He tries to understand them as who they are, not as maybe who we would want them to be, or even to pass judgment on them as much as. Yeah, I think one of the things that he benefited from, perhaps from his leadership in the denomination during the tumultuous years of the 1960s, is that there are multiple perspectives on events that are complicated. And in our limited and fallen mindset and world and reality, it's not always easy to parse out exactly who's in the right, who's in the wrong. And so there are some of the treatments that he does that or some of his historical analysis, I think particularly the Unicoi school attempt to start it, where it becomes clear this is a very complicated situation now, and that there are people kind of making accusations against each other about who undermines this, and he tries to give everybody a fair reading. And he says this is probably what actually happened, but it's also not meant to be derogatory toward anyone. He's also taking into account that pretty much everybody's trying to do something good and just get at cross purposes with one another. And perhaps there were also some people who were acting in bad faith, but anyway, so I think that that's a good way of going about it, is to take people seriously and to also not just immediately assume that they were bad actors if they do something that we wish they wouldn't have.
It's the golden rule of scholarship: do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Right.
It's like sometimes you get the impression that some people, it's as if they always interpret others through the worst possible lens, while simultaneously expecting that everyone else is going to view them through the best possible lens.
Sure.
Well, is there anything else that you'd like to say broadly about your chapter or about its content. I mean, we could do this all day,
Sure.
but
Um, I think that towards the end of the book, I talk about his methodology to some degree and about his use of the historical collection, and I think those things are perhaps useful and helpful for future researchers. I think my um, deep dive into his historical writing, and then also kind of refreshing my familiarity with the broader True Baptist historiography, pointed out to me how much we really need a deeper connection with the events that are going on around us when we're dealing with our True Baptist history. That's not that unusual. Most we would call like church histories of denominations. They tend to focus on their own interior politics and theology, and they just don't really interact with the broader cultural events. It's interesting. G.W. Million does a pretty good job of that actually with his history, his very early history of Real Baptist, and trying to kind of engage English immigration to North Carolina. But that being said, I think there's a lot of areas where we could really expand further on that we haven't, and so
you have plans to do that?
at some point I would like to when I get done with my dissertation, which doesn't really relate to this, but there are some connections. My research deals with the late 19th century and the kind of uh, cultural and religious implications of Reconstruction. And I've got to thinking a lot about how Reconstruction has affected Free Baptists. A Free Baptist denomination, the modern Free Baptist denomination, is still largely Southern, and uh, it will be interesting to see how that
Mm.
played into that. But I would like to look into that further. But anyway, so there are some other ideas I've had, but I think that we just need to pay attention to how the culture has influenced us
Mm.
over and over again. And I think that would be helpful to us in thinking through our own cultural moment. We're living through, perhaps everyone always feels like they're living through interesting times, but we certainly seem to be. And we're going to need to live with wisdom, I think, if we're going to navigate this well. So that's what I would say generally about that. So why don't we take a few minutes to talk about your chapter on philosophy?
Well, thank you for engaging with me on your chapter on history.
Yeah. Um, I'm always happy to talk about my writing. Uh, let's take a minute to perhaps tell people why we would have a chapter on philosophy in this book. Dr. Pickerley isn't necessarily known for writing on philosophy, although, as you mentioned in your chapter, that's very much implied in some of his writing, especially in the last few years. But he's also well known for that because so many students at Welch took his philosophy course, and I mean, and they just speak in very glowing terms about it. So, from your perspective, why would we include a chapter on philosophy from Dr. Early's work?
Well, firstly, if we're going to honor the work of Dr. Pickerelli, then we've got to include philosophy because philosophy was a big part of his scholarship. His scholarship, his teaching for a long, long time. You know, it's interesting what students think of Dr. Pickerelli partly has to do with what age or era they're from.
Mm.
So, because he didn't publish on philosophy in the same way that he publishes on, say, stuff related to pastoral ministry or theology or history, students today are less inclined to think about Dr. Pickerelli in philosophy. But as you referenced, go back several decades, and that's what people think of a lot because the philosophy course, well, everyone took the philosophy course because it was in the general education curriculum. So everyone took it, and everyone had Dr. Pickerelli for that. He taught it for decades, literally for decades. He initially used a book, an intro book that he liked, but then that book went out of print, and he couldn't find another book he liked. So what did he do? He wrote his own book. It remained unpublished, but you mentioned that one of the things we want to do in this volume is to expose people to the writing, to writings that he did that some people may not be familiar with. And so this chapter is partly an attempt to give a nod to his work over there. Something else I would add is that underneath his work in theology, maybe underneath is not the best description, but part and parcel of his work in theology, his work in history, even his work in shall we say practical theology, very much has a philosophical bent to it. I mean, there's a philosophical component or frame or level of analysis that he's bringing to each of those areas. And if you don't have a background in philosophy, you may or may not realize that it's there. But I can tell you, it is most definitely there. So philosophy, directly and indirectly, is informing practically everything he's doing, from my perspective.
So let me ask a clarifying question. I don't know that I've actually asked you. I've kind of assumed this was the case, and I was pretty sure it was. But even though this philosophy book was unpublished, he was assigning that to students in his course, if I'm not mistaken.
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
I'm not going to give a hard yes to that, but that is my understanding.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway, well, so one of the other things that you brought up there that I think plays into this. This again is not necessarily where his training had been, but that background in biblical studies, as well as I think his personality, which is very meticulous, lent itself well to the study of philosophy as well. Like that's part of the reason I think he is so philosophical about his approach to a number of these subjects is that he's thinking very carefully through each element of that. I know that was my experience when we started working in the historical collection, which is archival work. He had very detailed kind of process by which he pursued that. And he was very meticulous in the way that he went about it. And those things I think maybe lend themselves to that philosophical approach.
Something I would say is that just like some people might say, hypothetically, why should I care about so and so passed or 150 years ago in some other state? There are those people who wonder, what does philosophy have to do with the Bible?
Right.
And Dr. Picker really, for his part, demonstrates through his example, through his scholarship, through his teaching, that philosophy has very much to do with the Bible. Philosophy has very much to do with the life of the mind and with Christian thinking in general. And while there are, bad philosophies of men, Paul talks about that. There are also, most assuredly, good philosophies of man, and the scriptures also talk about that. In fact, the word philosophy etymologically means lover of or love of wisdom.
Mhm.
I mean, ultimately, in one sense, philosophy is about getting answers to hard questions about life so that we can live wisely.
Mhm. Right.
To that extent, the Proverbs, it's a book of philosophy. Ecclesiastes is a book of philosophy. The way of wisdom is the way of is philosophy.
So it's an important pursuit for all Christians. It's
Most assuredly.
not that every Christian is going to pursue philosophy to the same degree, but it's not outside of our realm of interest. It's not just for those folks, but I don't have to worry about it.
Any sort of apologetics, which Dr. Pickrell talks about, any sort of form of apologetics is practical philosophy.
Mhm.
So it's like you have theology, and then where you might talk about divine sovereignty and human freedom, and it's very technical.
Mhm.
And then you've got practical theology.
Mhm.
So you've got the very technical philosophy, just like you have technical theology,
Mhm.
but then you have very practical philosophy as well, just like you have practical theology. So I I I, I see these as two sides of the same coin, and that, by the way, is the classical view of the relationship between philosophy
Right.
and theology. that, theology is the queen of the sciences and philosophy is the handmaiden of theology.
Right. Yeah. So I also think that there's the other aspect, which is that philosophy is unavoidable.
It is.
We're all engaging in it to one level or another, and in all sorts of things. You know, my my father and I have been putting in a fence this week, and at one point we were taking a break in the air conditioned truck because it's really hot right now. And but we were discussing what we were going to do, and but also it was kind of broader than that. And I was reminded that when we got done, we were talking about it. But my dad, we often had those conversations growing up about various things, all kinds of stuff. And he would always talk about being philosophizing and and but then there was some that's really I mean he kind of uses it in a jokey kind of manner to some degree, but that was really true that we were doing some sort of philosophy of what we were doing. We were talking about the why of what we we're doing, the how, what purpose will this serve, and will it meet the ends that we desire?
Mm.
And so it seems that we are already doing those things to see whether or not we're doing it well or whether we're doing it poorly.
Mm.
And so um, Dr. Pickerley, it seems, would want us to do those things well.
Mm.
And one of the ways that we can be encouraged to pursue that well would be to get some sense, at least introductory sense, of what philosophical terms and vocabulary and methods. So, in what ways does Dr. Pickerley kind of help provide a good landscape overview of that material?
So Dr. Pickerley's unpublished work in philosophy, he says from the get-go that this is about forming and shaping one's worldview. So his lens, his interest is how this factors into our worldview. Part of what he is doing is to provide a survey of the basic people, the basic terms, and the basic questions, and then his answer on the basic questions, and what he believes is a what today we call a reformed Arminian answer on the basic questions. So some of the so he has a section on methodology where he's talking about logic and method and worldview. He has a section on epistemology where he talks about truth and knowledge. He has several chapters on metaphysics, which concerns ultimate reality, and then axiology, where he's very much talking about ethics and so what, and he gets into ethics proper and political philosophy and aesthetics and even philosophy of religion. So what Dr. Picker really is doing through this work is to provide a generalized overview. It's a type of survey book. For my part, in responding to that, I can't possibly, with any kind of depth, get into everything he talks about because that's just another book. So what I chose to do in my chapter is to give a broad overview of what he does, and then just pick a few of the subjects he deals with. By no means all of them, or even half of them, but just a fraction of the you know topics he presents, and then go really deep into those topics.
Okay.
Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. So let's look at a couple of those things that you focus on. I think that this kind of connects with our discussion already about how important this is, but Dr. Pickerley notes that this is essential for us, philosophy is essential for us to develop a intentional and robust Christian worldview.
Hmm.
And so maybe you could help us understand those connections between worldview and philosophy.
Well, I mean, these days, if you read worldview books, you're going to be exposed to philosophy and the general people and questions of philosophy. So if you're reading James Sire or just whomever on worldview, he's going to talk about Plato and Thomas Aquinas and Augustine and Aristotle and just various people. So we implicitly, I think, today recognize the connections between worldview thinking and philosophy. You made the point earlier that philosophy is part and parcel of what we're doing all the time anyway, even on the field working on fence posts. And so when Dr. Pick really worked on this, he's just showing those connections in a formal way. So the way that he arranges each chapter is that he will offer a rationale for why this is important, asking questions to draw you in as the reader.
Mm.
He'll then introduce the main people, the main terms, and the main answers to those questions. But in practically every chapter, he has a section on his analysis of the various solutions to the various problems that he's engaging. And to the same things that you said about history and him being careful and exacting, the very same methodology is there with his work in philosophy. There's even times where he says, I really like this solution, but I just can't quite get behind it. But I really like it. And so there are times where, there's an aspect in today's world where it's like, we don't want nuance. We want yes or no. But you see Dr. Picker really honestly, humbly working through some of these hard questions, some of these hard problems.
And that kind of brings us back to that discussion of his relationship with Mr. Forlines earlier in our conversation here, which is there was a recognition that ideas are to be taken seriously, but that they're not all good and they're not all bad. That some ideas, okay, that has some explanatory power, maybe, but yeah, doesn't quite.
It doesn't do it for me.
Yeah,
I can't exactly say why, but
But
here's the
then-
best I've got.
And also to be able to articulate, which takes time and thought to be able to take the idea seriously, analyze it, and then produce your reasons for saying, oh, this is a good point here, but it fails on these various other levels.
One of the things that he brings to his analysis is he's coming at these questions, these problems, from the perspective of a frugal Baptist, from the perspective of a Reformed Arminian, and so that vantage point is able to speak into those things.
Yeah, I wanted to bring that up because years ago when I was doing my master's level work, I had a professor who one time we were talking about Christian worldview in a history of American religion course, and he brought up worldview, and he's like, of course, that's depending on like which Christian worldview, because he was kind of deriding the idea that there is a Christian worldview. And I think he was incorrect in that analysis, because I do think there is a broad Christian worldview that is theistic, Trinitarian, and that relates to a whole host of things. But I do think there's an element of that which is correct, which is to say that as we begin to kind of parse out into various denominator or theological positions, that does inform and influence our philosophy and our worldview as it gets more granular. And so you are very clear to say in there that his Reformed Arminian theology informs his philosophy in very specific ways. And specifically, you deal with his thinking on apologetics and epistemology. So maybe could you flesh out for us how that Reformed Arminian background would really play into those specific aspects of his philosophy?
So I'll give an example of the way in which theology and philosophy really are companion subjects. There's a lot of so epistemology relates to its word. Literally, it means words about knowledge. It's the study of knowledge, the study of knowing. How do we know, and how do we know that we know? So this, therefore, gets into the question of truth. Through the history of Christian theology, one of the questions, one of the dominant questions, has related to what is truth? How is truth revealed? And how do we know that this is truth? How can we rely on this stuff as truth? So the way that Augustine answers that question versus the way that Thomas Aquinas answers that question, for example, are going to differ. That's not to say that they are complete opposites. In some ways, Thomas Aquinas is impacted by Augustine, but in other ways, Thomas Aquinas moves beyond where Augustine was. And so what ends up happening is these two guys have different epistemologies. So move forward to the reformers. Certainly, yeah, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Jacob Arminius, and you have these guys going back to the sources, the Ad Fontes stuff, and they're pulling a lot from Augustine. They're not pulling so strongly from Thomas Aquinas because they see him as having created some problems with respect to the question. Now, scholarship on Thomas Aquinas today is wanting to hash out some of those points, and I've got my opinions on those things, which we can talk about, another time. But the point here is to say this: depending on where you fall on these various questions, has implication on what you're thinking with respect to the mind. In other words, just to break it down, as Protestants, we believe in, as Reformed Protestants, we believe in total depravity. And we believe in the impact of sin and the impact of sin on the mind, sometimes called the noetic effects of the fall. So if we believe that as Reformed Arminians, then how does that impact our understanding of philosophy and just the way that we're going to seek, the way that we're going to try to search for truth or seek to understand truth? What does the fact that sin has impacted the mind mean for that? So if you're on one end of the spectrum, you might take for granted the fact that I'm thinking about this thing rightly. Whereas if you're on another end of the spectrum, you might be saying, well, just because I think that I'm thinking this rightly doesn't necessarily mean that I'm thinking about this thing rightly, because I recognize that I can deceive myself. So people following an Augustinian tradition, for example, in fact, among the reformers, somebody did a study among the reformers, Augustine is the most cited author among the reformers for all kinds of reasons,
Right.
But certainly including this reason. The point is a more Augustinian position that the reformers then take for their own, including Arminius, is going to, even before getting to the claims of what the mind is saying, is going to ask hard questions about the mind and about the extent to which we can rely on it. So I don't know. I'm sort of riffing around the question, but this question of the mind and the noetic effects of the fall on the mind and how it relates to the history of Christianity and where Dr. Piccarilli, as well as Richard Forlines, fits into that tradition. So both of these guys, Forlines and Piccarilli, they're very much following the classical Arminian approach to this question, which is ultimately harkening back to Augustine and what I would call biblical Christianity.
Right. Yeah. So I think that is helpful.
It's going to be a bit presupposition. We're going to presuppose that the Bible is right because it's God's revelation, and we're going to presuppose, therefore, that the mind is not always right. So if there are points of conflict between if there's points of conflict between what I think and what the Bible says, then revelation is going to have priority over reason.
Yes.
Not the other way.
That's right. And yeah, I think that was very helpful for me. You don't get into Dr. Piccarilli's philosophy of education much in your chapter, but President Matt Pinson in his tribute does deal with that to some degree. And I came across those writings when I was working on my master's thesis. They are articles, a couple of articles that he wrote, presentations to the faculty that Dr. Piccarilli wrote, that dealt with how that epistemological position would apply to our thinking on education. But in the process, he was talking about this Reformed Arminian epistemology that is very humble, I think, before the Lord, and very cautious about contradicting the Bible. And that was very beneficial to me personally as I was working through my graduate work, trying to get my head around new ideas and um, how to engage those, incorporate the good elements, and reject the bad if I could do those things. And so I found that tremendously helpful. And then when I came on faculty at Welch College, I found that very beneficial in us thinking through a particular discipline. And it doesn't just have to do with the discipline of study, but any aspect of our lives needs that kind of analysis and it needs that kind of careful, um, thoughtful, and also maybe a hermeneutic of humility, of just assuming I don't necessarily know the right answer.
One of the themes that's come from this conversation is that just because somebody thinks it, or just because somebody says it, doesn't make it so.
That's right.
And in some ways, that's what Dr. Piccirilli is observing
Right.
in his work on epistemology. Something else I would add that's interesting for me to think about, particularly in that section, I'm interacting with Dr. Piccirilli's ideas, but I'm also comparing them to Mr. Forline's ideas.
Right.
Because sometimes when we think about presuppositional apologetics or epistemology, we might think of Mr. Forline's and the quest for truth, and no doubt he talks about these things. But I mean, Dr. Piccirilli, from my vantage point, is very much a companion to Mr. Forline's with respect to his work on epistemology. And I put their quotations beside one another. They're saying very much the same thing. At times, their phrases are rather similar.
Hmm.
What's interesting to me is Quest for Truth comes out in the early 2000s.
Hmm.
Um, he's working on this, I think, in the 90s, in the early 2000s, in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so I'm just imagining that over the course of the 80s and the 90s and leading into these guys are having lunch together, eating lunch together, going out together, and they're working through their ideas literally together. And so it goes back to this theme of it's really important for us to have people in our lives who will challenge us and who will help us to see where we're going right, where we're going wrongly. And sometimes perhaps one person is at a 3 and another person is at a 7, but maybe by talking to one another, they get closer. They're more like a 4.5 and a 5.5.
Sure.
Something that I desperately long for, that I find difficult. Uh, it's difficult to find sometimes. I long to have meaningful conversations about issues that matter with people. There are some people with whom I can talk, and have meaningful conversations. But something I've noticed um, in our age is that it's hard to get someone to criticize you and your ideas. So you can literally say, here's what I'm thinking, and here's the reasons I'm thinking it. What do you guys think? Am I wrong here? Am I misguided here? And it's hard to get anybody to speak up. But I need someone to speak up,
Right.
Um, because all of us need our ideas challenged.
Hmm.
That's the whole thing about his section on epistemology. Just because we thought it and just because we have good reasons
Hmm.
for thinking that it's right doesn't necessarily think it's right. I've recently been reading some of the writings of Blaise Pascal, and he points out that if we come to conclusions on our own, those conclusions tend to be more cemented in our minds as being true. And there are both positive and negative ways to think about that. But a negative way to think about that is if we've come to a conclusion in our minds about a thing, and that therefore makes it stronger, if that idea is wrong
Hmm.
or needs to be couched differently, that's actually a very dangerous thing. So we actually need one another.
Yeah.
And then the flip side of that is sometimes other people will say things and I will challenge them in their ideas. And it starts to feel a little bit uncomfortable. But it doesn't need to feel uncomfortable. It shouldn't feel uncomfortable. I don't think that I've been particularly rude about it or anything like that. It's just, to your point earlier, we live in an age where people aren't as used to their ideas being challenged.
Hmm.
Um, but we need that.
Yeah.
We desperately need that.
So, maybe to tie these things together and close out our conversation about your chapter, we've talked about the importance of dialogue,
Hmm.
of conversation, of the challenging of one another's thoughts about the world and about how to proceed in the world. That has very practical application when we think about the realm of politics. And Dr. Pickerley also delves into that area in his philosophy and gives us some good guidelines to pursuing our political philosophy as Christians. And that's the other important element there. He doesn't leave out the fact that we're Christians as we pursue that. So, could you give us some uh, ideas that he offers that are very helpful for us in this current context where so much of our politics is not reflected? I'm not just talking about political leaders, I'm talking about our political conversations with other people, if we're even willing to have them. Oftentimes are not guided by genuine ideas and thought, but it's name recognition or it is firing points that we've gotten from a news outlet or a social media outlet. What are some more robust and more Christian ways of going about our political thinking?
Political philosophy is a subset of ethics. Ethics is a subset of philosophy. So politics is very much a subject of philosophy. Going all the way back to Aristotle, part of the reason that we perhaps don't engage in political conversations well is because we've not understood its broader context within philosophical and therefore theological methodology and all the rest. Dr. Piccarelli, for his part, gives 6 principles in his section on political philosophy. I'm not going to take the time at present to go through all 6 of them, unless you'd like me to, read them um, and comment briefly on them. But I would simply say this, and trying to boil it down, I would say this. Dr. Piccarelli recognizes ideals. He recognizes ideals. He recognizes universals. And he simultaneously recognizes or realizes that we live in the real world.
Hmm.
So, I think it's John Stott says that one of the hardest bridges to build is the bridge between heaven and this world. Like, how do we relate the ideals to this world? I think that's Stott, but I could be mistaken about that. We very much see that in Dr. Pickering. And to go back to this theme that we've established, it's the same sort of stuff that we see in Mr. Forlines. So, Mr. Forlines, I think it's chapter 9 of his biblical ethics book. I've come back to this time and again. I think it's great. He talks about, he says perfectionism it creates problems in a Christian ethic. Um, he coins this term realistic idealism.
Hmm.
Realistic idealism. So we care about ideals, but we're realistic about those ideals. So we're living in the real world. And for his part, Mr. Forlines is he's talking broadly and generally about ethics. But because politics is a part of ethics, I think that these principles apply in politics as well. I see the exact same thing in Dr. Pickerel.
Hmm.
He expresses them through his 6 principles uh, and develops them throughout. He doesn't use the term realistic idealism, but the concept is there. So he very much has his ideals, but he's realistic about those ideals.
Mm.
Um, so to bring this to your question, sometimes what I see is you have, let's say, two positions on a political question. And you have the ideals of this position and you have the ideals of that position.
Mhm.
And we could speak from a metaphysical point of view as to whose ideals are more correct. That's a different conversation. But let's just say you've got two sets of ideals. And what I see is people of various groups just shouting their ideals at one another.
Mhm.
And the fact is, yes, we have our ideals, but we also live in the real world.
Mhm.
And we have to build a bridge to the real world. So it's all well and good to have our ideals, but we somehow have to figure out a way to translate our ideals into reality.
Mhm.
So even going back to Plato, I mean, even he recognized that. So for his part, he believed in the world of the forms,
Mhm.
but he believed in the meantime, we're in the cave, or we've escaped the cave and we're on this journey, making our way uh, to the world of the forms. But the point is, you don't just snap your fingers and go from
Right.
the cave to the world of the forms. It's a journey, and you
Mhm.
have to recognize that you are where you are in this journey, and to be unrealistic about where you are
Mhm.
in this journey is not helpful because it's not, to use that term, honest. We've got to
Mhm.
be honest about where we are.
Mhm.
So you have some people. So on this, the terms idealism and realism are used differently and mean different things, whether you're talking about ontology or epistemology or axiology, ethics, politics. But in the world of say ethics, you've got your idealists on the one hand, and that's one extreme. You've got your realists on the other hand. So if you read the writings of, say, Reinhold Niebuhr,
Mhm.
we're outside of the world of sort of conservative evangelical Christianity here, but he's very much about Christian realism, and perhaps he goes too far in this direction, whereas the other extreme goes too far in the other direction.
Right.
But in the middle, and this is the beauty of Reformed Arminianism and the Reformed Arminian position, you've got all these extremes around you, but the Reformed Arminian finds a way to over and over and over and over again to recognize that the truth is more complicated.
Mhm.
It's not this extreme position or that extreme position, you know,
Mhm.
whether it's Calvinism over there and Wesleyanism over there. It's
Right.
like you can take this analogy in all kinds of different directions. But as it regards, say, the political question, the ethical question more generally, even there's ideals and there's reality, and you can get so into reality that you lose your ideals.
Mhm.
We don't want that.
Right.
Or you could get so into your ideals that you're not living in the real world, and we got to find a way to bridge them both. And what that means is, particularly when it comes to politics,
Mhm.
we are living in a broken world with sinful people,
Mhm.
and this is going to mean hard decisions. But we've got to be honest and realistic about the implications of making different decisions.
Mhm.
So we can remain stuck with our ideals while simultaneously doing great harm to the actual world. So
Mhm.
we've got to somehow find a way to responsibly bridge these things.
Sure.
That's the big theme that I see in Dr. Piccirilli. If I were to take his 6 principles and just kind of boil them down,
Sure.
and I think that there's camaraderie again with
Right.
Mr. Forlans there.
And I think that there was another aspect of that, which is to his thinking on this, which is not necessarily new, but it's just a good reminder for us in our current context, is that political positions are grounded in a worldview.
Oh yes.
And so biblical Christians shouldn't feel at home in just any political philosophy.
Hmm.
And um, he kind of addresses the various political philosophies. He tries to give a sketch of their worldview that undergirds them. I think that's helpful because sometimes when we're talking about philosophy or politics in our current context, it does come down to team recognition. You know, I'm blue, you're red. or vice versa. Or maybe you choose to go out and say, I don't like blue or red. I'm going to choose green.
No, I'm going to choose white because
Yes.
it's idealism.
That's right.
It's pure idealism. So they're on team white.
That's right.
And both of these other teams are beneath them.
That's right, because this is the untainted position. This is too muddled with, political parties and money and power, but this is the real position. So instead of kind of doing those positionings based on affinity for the people that are involved with those politics, that's part of it. Like some of us just are personally drawn to one political leader or another, or even sensibility wise, we're kind of drawn to a general political position. That's not what should be driving us, though, it seems. I think Dr. Pickerley would suggest from what you have said here is that we should be much more intentional about how our worldview plays into our
So he spends time talking about the underlying worldviews of political conservatism and political liberalism. He is not dealing with political progressivism, or as I heard one commentator say, transgressionism.
Yes.
But because he's writing, 25 years ago or whatever,
Right.
so he's dealing with what's dominant there, and he feels more at home in definitely political conservatism. I was, thinking about all these points that you brought up in our conversation. I was literally having a conversation with somebody the other day, and credit on them for being willing to have a conversation about it. And I was espousing the view that, just to get into it, however we vote, whatever decision we make in the fall about whether we vote or don't vote, whatever decision we make will have a direct or an indirect impact on the eventual outcome. That's different than saying that I bear personal culpable responsibility for what happens. But the reality is that my decision to do this or to do that, whether to vote for this or that or not to vote or whatever, however I vote or not, will have direct or indirect implications for what eventually happens. And the policies that are going to follow that elected leader. And the person with whom I was dialoguing, to his credit that he dialogued with me about it, he in a roundabout way said, the implications of this, they make me uncomfortable and they kind of offend me a little bit. I'm super glad he was honest about it. But my response was, but is it wrong? Like we're interested in truth here. Is what I've said wrong? It may be, it may make us uncomfortable and a little queasy, but is it wrong? Now that doesn't mean that the answer becomes obvious after that point, but it's the whole point that we have to reckon honestly with reality and the implications of things. Something else I would say about this idealism thing versus this realism thing, I go back to Jesus. If idealism is God in heaven, then we need to think about the fact that God, Christ, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but humbled himself, and he incarnated among us. The point is, he put on human flesh. He tabernacled among us. He who knew no sin became sin for us. And he said things like, he rubbed shoulders with really problematic people. He said things like, pray that God's will would be done on earth as it is in heaven. And that he demonstrated the way in which that can take place by realistically engaging with very problematic people in a very problematic world, but nonetheless engaging with them. So you're bringing the ideals of heaven, as it were, into a very broken and complicated world. So that's very much what Doctor. So for Jesus's point, yeah, team white, team blue, team red, whatever. The point is, he gets his hands dirty, so to speak. He doesn't become sinful. Obviously, he's like us in every way, sin accepted. He doesn't become sinful, but he gets his hands dirty, so to speak. He
Right.
puts on human flesh. He enters our world. He doesn't sort of,
Right.
snub his nose at it. And that's very much what Dr. Pickerley is doing in his political philosophy stuff. I mean, he gives these sort of meta broad principles, but then he gets in the weeds a bit
Right.
in ways that might make some people feel a little bit uncomfortable, but that is realistic idealism. You
Right.
have your ideals, but you're getting into it in an honest way,
Yes.
talking about the underlying worldviews of the actual people and the parties of in our context.
Hmm. Well, before we close, do you have any other general thoughts from your work, either in the philosophy chapter, or you also wrote the conclusion, and you also obviously helped edit this book. And so, were there any other major takeaways that you wanted to just highlight before we leave?
I would say that I would say two things. I would say number one, what I appreciate about Dr. Piccarelli is that he wants to have honest conversations and he wants to get into the weeds of things. He strikes me as someone who's interested in having honest conversations and in truth. And I long desperately um, for a world in which we can have honest conversations and critical, by which I mean analytical, critical and careful conversations that are also charitable and compassionate. And I think we see this from him over and over and over and over. He has cultivated the virtue of courage, and he demonstrates courage throughout his writings by taking positions that he believes is right, but that may not be popular. Um, in certain crowds, it's not popular to be an Arminian theologically, and yet he rubs shoulders with people, and he courageously puts in that context, and he courageously puts forward his positions. Um, and then to say that you're a reformational Arminianism, that was his term. It makes a certain, say, Calvinists a little queasy. Like that's their thing, you know, not yours, kind of thing. So I appreciate that he gets into the weeds and that he's courageous about it, while also being charitable. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say is I believe strongly that our theology, our worldview, our beliefs, it's very much impacted by the scriptures. That's the primary thing. And more broadly, we might just say God's revelation to us. But also an inescapable frame that you mentioned is history. And so I believe strongly in honoring those who have come before us and really wrestling with their ideas, because it's what God has told us to do. God has told us to honor our father and mother, which has implication for our natural parents, our adoptive parents, whatever the case may be. But there's a principle there that has implication for our spiritual parents as well. Um, Solomon says, I mentioned this in my conclusion. Solomon says in Proverbs 2, uh, if you would know the fear of the Lord, you will listen to me. That's what he tells uh, his son. And so, if we would know the fear of the Lord, we need to honor and respect those people who have come before us.
Hmm. Yeah.
That doesn't mean necessarily that we're going to agree with everything they've said, but I don't come to a Mr. Forlines. I don't come to a Dr. Piccarelli. I don't come to a whomever. I don't come to these people as I don't presume to think that I'm somehow their equal. They are for me a forebear. They are for me someone that I want to show regard for and honor for. Um, and uh, and so those are the two things that I would say.
Well, we thank you for joining us for this edition of HSF Conversations, our uh, video podcast work on for the HSF. And we hope you'll join us for future conversations. We discuss various aspects of ministry or of theology or practical applications of those things in the world. And we do encourage you to check out and purchase a copy of Teacher, Scholar, Shepherd, Essays in Honor of Robert E. Piccirilli. We're proud of it. We think it's going to be very beneficial to scholars going forward, and also to laymen and women who are just interested in knowing more about Frugal Baptist thought and Frugal Baptist actions in the 20th and 21st century. And for those that know Dr. Piccirilli, either as a instructor in college or as a denominational figure, or maybe even just a man who sat beside them in church for years and has taught their Sunday school lessons or preached at revivals. So we encourage you to purchase the book. It is published through D6 Ministries. You can find copies of that at D6's website, or anywhere you can, purchase books online. Amazon is carrying it as well. So we encourage you to purchase a copy. And we hope you found this discussion helpful. We've tried to talk about things that are very clearly covered in the chapter, but in chapters of this book, but also to go beyond that and maybe expand into new areas as we work our way through that. So we thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll do so again soon.